It began like any other day. At least, that's how it seemed at first. The news had been filled with murmurs about an unusual virus spreading rapidly across the country, but no one expected what came next. That morning, life seemed normal enough, yet by afternoon, the world was plunged into chaos. Samantha Ford sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. The notifications were relentless, a flood of alerts warning of rapidly spreading infections. She had no idea how quickly things would devolve into madness. It started with people getting sick, unexplained fevers, a strange rash, and soon the reports began trickling in. People weren't just getting sick, they were changing. By noon, the streets outside her apartment building were filled with an eerie silence. No traffic, no people walking their dogs, just the occasional distant siren that seemed to echo through the city like a ghost. At first, she thought it was just some kind of citywide panic, but the smell, the overwhelming stench of decay, began to seep in. Her stomach churned as the realization hit. This wasn't just another outbreak. This was something far worse. Samantha grabbed her keys and her bag, stuffing it with essentials, water, food, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. She hesitated for a moment. What about her family? Her sister, Grace, lived across town. There was no way of knowing if Grace had heard the news or if she was even still alive. But leaving her apartment was risky. The roads were already being shut down by emergency workers, the ones who hadn't already been turned into these things. Shoving the thought of Grace into the back of her mind, Samantha stepped out into the hallway. It was eerily quiet. She'd never heard the building so still. The elevator wasn't an option, too risky. She took the stairs, moving quickly but cautiously. When she reached the ground floor, the lobby was empty. No sign of her neighbors. But then she heard it, a sound she'd never forget. A low, guttural growl. Samantha's heart stopped. She peered around the corner, barely daring to breathe. There, in the doorway, stood one of them. Its clothes were ragged, its skin pale and mottled with bruises, but its eyes, those eyes were the worst part. They were empty, wild, unfocused, and yet, somehow, filled with an insatiable hunger. Samantha froze. It wasn't human anymore. Whatever it was not the person who once lived in the apartment down the hall. Her instincts kicked in, and she bolted for the back exit. She didn't dare look back. The noise from the growl was getting louder, accompanied by a shuffling sound that could only mean more of them were coming. She made it outside just as another scream echoed from inside the building. The streets were chaos. People were running, screaming, crashing into cars as they tried to flee. But there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. In every direction, the city was consumed by madness. The sound of sirens had been replaced with the unmistakable, horrifying growl of the infected as they poured from every alley and doorway. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She ran toward her car, praying it hadn't been wrecked or overrun with infected. To her relief, it was still intact. She jumped in and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. She had no idea where she was going, but she couldn't stay here. Not with them roaming the streets. She fumbled with the ignition, her hands trembling as she finally got the engine to turn over. The car jerked forward, and she hit the gas. There was a split second of hope, maybe she could make it out of the city. But the road ahead was blocked. Cars had crashed into each other, creating an impassable pile-up. She swerved, barely avoiding a group of panicked pedestrians who had started to tear at each other in desperation. With no other options, Samantha took a sharp turn onto a side road, hoping it would lead to safety. Her mind raced with thoughts of her sister, of her family, of the world she once knew. But all of that seemed so far away now. The further she drove, the more the world around her seemed to unravel. Fires burned in the distance, and the sound of distant screams echoed in the air. This was only the beginning. And she had no idea how long she could survive this new world. She glanced at the rearview mirror and saw movement behind her. Her heart sank. A group of infected had spotted her. And they were coming fast. Samantha's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she glanced back at the growing horde behind her. Her breath quickened. The infected were gaining on her, their grotesque forms lurching and stumbling forward with an unsettling speed. She floored the gas pedal, her car jerking forward with a screech of tires as she swerved past another wrecked vehicle. The road ahead was a blur, the world around her a chaotic mess of broken infrastructure and abandoned vehicles. She knew she needed to get off the main road, but every side street she tried seemed to lead nowhere, either blocked by debris, abandoned cars, or worse, more of the infected. The rearview mirror showed them getting closer. She could make out the sickly, decayed faces of the creatures, their vacant eyes locked onto her. The growls echoed louder now, a constant reminder of the danger she was in. Her heart raced in time with the engine, and she prayed she could find somewhere safe, somewhere to regroup. Just as she thought the worst might be over, she turned a corner and skidded to a halt. A roadblock. A few cars had been hastily abandoned in front of a large construction site, but that wasn't what made her pulse spike. It was the figures standing between the cars, shadows moving with deliberate slowness. People, or rather, what used to be people, were standing at the blockade, staring at her with empty eyes. Samantha's mind screamed to turn around, but the infected were still coming from behind, closing in fast. She had no choice but to face what lay ahead. With trembling hands, she pushed the car into reverse, praying she could escape back the way she came. But it was too late. The infected had already reached the roadblock. They didn't seem to notice her at first, they were fixated on each other, on the sounds they made, the grotesque clicking noises that had become their language. But the moment her tires screeched in reverse, their heads snapped toward her, their faces twisted with the unmistakable hunger. Samantha shoved the car into drive again and slammed on the gas, narrowly missing one of them as it lunged at her side mirror. She veered sharply, making another turn onto a smaller street, hoping it would lead to safety. Her eyes darted across the street signs, looking for any sign of hope, but every turn seemed to take her further into chaos. The city was a war zone now, streets once familiar to her now looked unrecognizable, overtaken by wreckage, abandoned cars, and groups of the infected. What had been an ordinary day had turned into a nightmare, and the real horror was just beginning. She needed a plan. But what could she do in a city overrun with these things? How could she survive alone in a place where everyone seemed to be either dead or changed? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a small convenience store ahead, its windows boarded up but the door cracked open just a sliver. Without thinking, she pulled over and cut the engine, taking a deep breath. The infected hadn't followed her onto this street, but they weren't far behind. She needed supplies, food, water, anything that could help her make it through the next few hours. The store was quiet when she stepped inside, though the faint smell of rot lingered in the air. Samantha's footsteps were cautious, echoing off the linoleum floor as she moved toward the aisles. The shelves were nearly empty, looted long before she had arrived. But there were still a few cans of beans, bottles of water, and a packet of dried fruit that would have to do for now. As she bent to gather what she could, a noise made her freeze. The unmistakable shuffle of footsteps, closer than before. Samantha's heart lurched in her chest. She darted into the aisle, pressing herself against the shelves and holding her breath. There was no way she could outrun them now if they found her, not with what little fuel was left in her car. Her only hope was to remain silent, to wait until they passed. The infected were slow, but they were relentless. She saw one of them from her hiding spot, its pale eyes scanning the aisles, its head twitching in unnatural ways. It sniffed the air, and then, it stopped. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. It was right in front of her, so close she could hear the rattling breath that came from its lungs. Then, as though it had lost interest, it turned away and shuffled down the aisle. Her pulse slowed, but only for a moment. She waited, counting the seconds in her mind, before slipping back toward the door. She had what she needed, just enough to keep going. But the clock was ticking. There was no more time to waste. She had to keep moving. The door creaked behind her as Samantha stepped out of the convenience store, the weight of the supplies in her backpack grounding her in the moment. The world outside felt different now, more oppressive, darker. The streets were bathed in the dim orange glow of streetlights flickering intermittently, as though the city itself was dying. But the silence was just as unnerving as the chaos had been. No more sirens, no more shouts from desperate survivors, just the distant growls and shuffles of the infected, growing louder by the second. Samantha's car was still parked at the curb. She hesitated before getting in. It wasn't just the infected she had to worry about anymore. The world had changed so quickly that survival itself had become a cruel game of chance. But she couldn't think too much about that, she had to move. She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. A low rumble vibrated through the car as she started the engine. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, but they revealed the wreckage of the road ahead, crashed cars, abandoned bikes, and the skeletal remains of once thriving streets now haunted by the living dead. She pressed on the gas, but her pace was cautious. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself. Turning another corner, Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She spotted a figure in the distance. A person, alive, standing in the middle of the street, motionless. Could it be? Her instincts told her to stay away, to keep driving. But something deep within her, something that had long been buried in the mundane rhythms of her life, urged her to stop. A glimmer of hope flared in her chest. Maybe this person knew something, had a plan, or had found somewhere safe. Without thinking, she slowed the car and pulled over to the side. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing in her chest. It's just another person, she whispered to herself, trying to make sense of the sudden urgency. It didn't matter if they were a survivor or not, what mattered was the chance to make a connection. She stepped out of the car, glancing over her shoulder to make sure there were no infected following her. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the street. It wasn't until she was closer that she saw the blood. Her stomach turned. The person was badly injured, their clothes torn and stained with blood. The signs were unmistakable. They had been attacked, possibly by one of the infected. But their eyes were not vacant. They were alert, nervous, and when they saw her approach, they immediately raised their hand in a gesture of warning. "Don't come any closer," they rasped, their voice hoarse from pain. "They'll hear you." Samantha stopped in her tracks, unsure of what to do. Who did this to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, they glanced over their shoulder, their eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. "You're not the first one to show up," they muttered. "They're getting bolder. They'll come for you next if you're not careful." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "Who's coming for me? Who's they?" The stranger's eyes flickered back to her, their expression hardening. "The infected," they said, gritting their teeth. "But worse, others. The survivors. People who've lost their humanity. They hunt us down, pick us off one by one. The apocalypse, it's just as much about people as it is about the undead." Samantha swallowed hard. She had heard rumors about rogue groups of survivors, but to hear it spoken out loud made the situation feel even more dire. She wasn't just fighting against the infected. She was fighting against the darkness and human nature itself. "What do you want me to do?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking slightly as she took a step closer, wary of the stranger's injuries. "I can help. I have supplies. We can." The stranger suddenly cut her off, their hand raised again. "You don't get it, do you?" they spat, their eyes wide and frantic. "This isn't about supplies. It's about survival. They'll take everything you've got and leave you with nothing. You're better off alone." Before Samantha could respond, a distant noise broke the silence. The unmistakable shuffle of the infected. The stranger's eyes widened in panic. "Get back to your car," they shouted. "Now! They're here!" Samantha turned to look in the direction the stranger was pointing, her heart pounding as she saw them. The infected were coming, their grotesque forms emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made real. Without thinking, she sprinted back to her car, throwing open the door and jumping in. The engine roared to life, and she slammed the gas pedal down. But as she sped off, a chilling scream echoed behind her, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The stranger was gone. Samantha's hands were shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Her mind raced, replaying the encounter with the stranger over and over again. Who were they? What had they meant by others? Was there really a group of survivors hunting down the weak, or was it just a desperate attempt to make her leave? But the look in their eyes, those eyes filled with such fear, had told her more than words ever could. The drive was a blur, her thoughts fragmented and chaotic. The image of the stranger's final scream echoed in her ears, the sound of it so vivid, so raw, that it almost felt as though it had been her own. But she couldn't afford to dwell on it. If she did, she would lose herself. There was no room for grief in a world that had already fallen apart. She glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. The road behind her was empty. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the danger wasn't just out there, but closing in from every side. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the world was swallowed by shadows, the streets illuminated only by the dim headlights of her car. She had no plan, no destination. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. There were too many unknowns. The road twisted and turned as she wound her way through the deserted city, each intersection a reminder of how life used to be. The convenience store, the crowded streets, the noise of city life, all of it seemed like a dream now. And the world she had known, the one before the outbreak, felt like something from a past life. A flicker of movement ahead caught her eye. Samantha slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat as she jerked the car to a stop. In front of her, there was another person. This time, a man, crouched in the shadows at the edge of the road. He didn't move at first. He just stared at her car, his eyes wide and unblinking. He looked familiar. But she couldn't place him. His clothes were ragged, his face dirty and worn, as if he had been living out in the streets for weeks. Samantha's instincts screamed at her to drive away, to keep moving. But something in the man's posture, something in the way he was watching her, told her that he wasn't a threat. Not yet. She hesitated, her hands still on the gearshift. Was this another survivor? Another person struggling to make it through the apocalypse? Or was he hiding something more dangerous? What if he was part of the group the stranger had warned her about? What if he was one of them? Her mind was filled with doubt, but she knew that she couldn't let fear control her. She had already come this far, and she couldn't afford to turn back now. Rolling down her window, she called out, her voice weary but steady. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a cautious step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. I need help," he finally said, his voice strained. "I've been running from them. Please, I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Samantha narrowed her eyes, studying him carefully. He seemed desperate, but there was something in his tone that didn't sit right. He was too calm for someone who had just been running from danger. Was he trying to gain her trust? Or was he genuinely in need of help? "I can help you," she said carefully, still keeping her distance. "But I need to know who you are. What's going on? Are you alone?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering to the ground before meeting her gaze again. "I'm Michael," he said finally. "And yes, I'm alone. I need a place to rest. I can't do this anymore. I've seen things." Samantha watched him, her hands still on the car door. "What kind of things?" His eyes darkened, and he looked away, as if ashamed. "I've seen people who were supposed to be human, but they're not. They're like animals, hunting us down. And I don't know how much longer I can outrun them." Samantha felt a chill run through her. This was it. This was what the stranger had meant. These weren't just the infected they were running from. These were people, survivors, who had lost whatever humanity they had left. "I've heard about them," Samantha said quietly. "I've been warned about groups like that. Michael's face twisted in frustration. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about control. Power. They'll take everything from you, your food, your weapons, your will to live. And if you don't submit, if you don't join them, they'll kill you. They'll leave you for the infected to find. Samantha swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong move, and she could end up just like the stranger, alone, vulnerable, and hunted. Get in, she said, her voice firm. I'll help you. But we need to keep moving. And I don't trust anyone who doesn't have a plan. Got it? Michael nodded, his face filled with relief as he climbed into the passenger seat. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I won't forget this. Samantha didn't respond. The road ahead was uncertain, the future a maze of danger and deception. But for now, she had a companion, and that made all the difference. The car rumbled steadily as it cut through the quiet streets, the headlights slicing through the shadows like a lifeline. Michael sat beside Samantha, his eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror and to the sides of the road, constantly alert. Every few minutes, he would glance over at her, but his expression remained unreadable. Samantha kept her focus on the road, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. Trusting a stranger wasn't something she did lightly. She had no idea if Michael was telling the truth, or if he had just made up his story to gain her trust. The world had become a breeding ground for lies, and survival was no longer just about food and shelter, it was about knowing who could be trusted and who would cut your throat the second your back was turned. As the miles passed, the tension between them grew. They hadn't spoken much since he'd climbed into the car, and every silence felt like a weight pressing on Samantha's chest. She had no plan. She had no place to go. The city was crawling with the infected, and the stories Michael had told her about other survivors were far worse than anything she had imagined. She glanced at him briefly, noting how his fingers fidgeted nervously with the torn sleeve of his jacket. Where exactly did you come from? She asked cautiously. You said you've been running from them, how long have you been on the road? Michael hesitated before answering, his gaze shifting to the window as if he were recalling the events in his mind. A few weeks. Maybe more. I was with a group, there were about 6 of us. We had a safe house in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. But things started changing. People started getting paranoid, acting strange. And then the attacks came. Not from the infected, but from other survivors. Samantha frowned. You mean people like you and me? Not the zombies, but actual people? Michael's face hardened. Yeah. People who were still human, but who had lost their humanity. They took what they wanted, food, supplies, even people. And when you tried to fight back, they didn't hesitate. It was kill or be killed. Samantha's stomach twisted in knots. The images Michael painted were disturbing, far worse than the horrors of the infected. At least with them, the danger was obvious. But humans? They were far more unpredictable. You said there were 6 of you. What happened to the rest of your group? Samantha asked quietly, her curiosity getting the better of her. Michael's eyes darkened as he turned away, his voice barely above a whisper. They're dead. Every single one of them. They came in the night. We didn't even see it coming. They got Sarah first, she was the youngest. Then Henry, they just ripped him apart. I tried to fight back, but there were too many. By the time I got out, I was the last one left. The words hit Samantha like a punch to the gut. The thought of being completely alone in this world was almost too much to bear, and she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if the same thing happened to her. If she trusted Michael, would she be the next target? Would he turn on her when things got desperate? The car slowed as they approached another intersection. Samantha's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't sure why, but something about Michael's story didn't sit right with her. It wasn't the events themselves, they were horrifying, but they didn't seem too different from what she had already witnessed. It was the way he told the story. The flatness in his voice, the coldness in his eyes. "What do you want from me, Michael?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of suspicion. "Why are you here, in this car, with me? What's your endgame?" Michael didn't respond immediately. He seemed to think for a moment before speaking, his voice low and strained. "I don't have an endgame, Samantha. I'm just trying to survive. I'm just trying to stay alive, one more day." Samantha didn't believe him. She couldn't. She had learned the hard way that survival often came at the expense of others. But what if she was wrong? What if he truly was just another soul lost in this hellish new world, looking for a sliver of hope? Before she could speak again, the sound of shuffling feet interrupted her thoughts. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The infected. She slammed on the brakes, sending the car skidding to a halt just a few feet away from a group of them stumbling down the street. They hadn't seen her yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. The stench of decay was thick in the air, the familiar growls and hisses rising from the group as they shuffled closer. Samantha's mind raced. She could back up, but there were infected behind them now, and she wasn't sure which direction was safe. They were trapped. "Get out of the car," she whispered urgently to Michael. "We need to go, now." But when she turned to look at him, she found him staring at her with a strange intensity. His eyes glinted with something darker than fear, something that sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could react, Michael's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a vice-like grip. "You're not leaving, Samantha," he said, his voice cold, his tone laced with an edge of menace. "Not yet." A knot tightened in her stomach. Her instincts screamed that she was in danger. Michael wasn't just another survivor. He had something else in mind, and she wasn't about to let him control the situation. She yanked her wrist free from his grasp, her pulse racing. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising in alarm. Michael's face contorted in frustration. "I'm trying to save us both," he hissed. "If you don't do exactly what I say, we'll both be dead. The infected are the least of our problems. You don't get it yet, but you will." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, fear mixing with the rising sense of betrayal. This was it. The line had been crossed. She couldn't trust him. Not anymore. The air in the car felt thick with tension, suffocating. Michael's grip on Samantha's wrist lingered in her memory, the heat of his fingers burned into her skin as if he had marked her in some twisted way. His words still echoed in her mind, "The infected are the least of our problems." That was what had sent the chill through her. He wasn't just scared, he was hiding something. And Samantha had learned long ago that in a world like this, people's true intentions were often buried beneath layers of desperation and lies. The car was still surrounded by the infected, their grotesque forms shuffling in the streets just beyond the glass. The sound of their gnashing teeth and labored breathing mixed with the strained silence between her and Michael. Samantha's pulse quickened, the panic from the situation reaching her chest like a vice. The tension between them was palpable, almost suffocating, but she couldn't afford to get lost in it. Survival came first. "Michael," she said, her voice low, controlled. "What's going on? What are you not telling me?" His eyes flickered briefly, but he didn't answer right away. He seemed to be calculating, weighing the decision in his mind. His gaze darted to the infected, then back to her. "I told you," he said, his tone clipped. "We don't have much time. We're surrounded." Samantha's breath hitched as she caught sight of them. The infected had begun to notice the car. Their heads twisted toward her vehicle, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, but relentless. It wouldn't be long before they reached the car, and she would have nowhere to run. But the danger of the undead wasn't the only threat. Michael had crossed a line, and now she had to decide whether to trust him or to fight for her life alone. "What do you want, Michael?" Her voice hardened as she turned to face him, every muscle tense. "What's your game? You can't just keep dragging me along like this. You don't get to control me." For a moment, there was nothing but the noise of the infected and the low hum of the car's engine. Michael's eyes darkened, his jaw clenched. I told you, he repeated, but now his voice was edged with a dangerous calm. The infected are just the beginning. They're everywhere, and they're going to keep coming. But there are worse things. Worse people. Samantha's heart hammered in her chest. Worse people. It wasn't the first time she had heard the words, but Michael's voice made it feel so much more real. She had already seen the truth in the stranger's warning. Survivors who preyed on other survivors, who tore others down just to stay alive. Michael took a deep breath and turned to face her fully, leaning in as if to reveal some deep, buried truth. There's a group, he said, his voice barely a whisper, and I'm part of it. But I'm not just running from them. I'm running from what they've become. Samantha stiffened. So it was true. Michael wasn't just another survivor, he was part of something far more dangerous. They took everything, he continued, his eyes flickering with something darker. They took my friends, my family, and they're coming for me. They want me back. They think I've got something they need. Samantha's mind raced. What could he have that they need? The tension in the car felt like it could snap any moment. Michael's secret was out, but she still didn't know the full truth. She had no choice but to decide now. Her instincts told her she couldn't trust him, but the infected were closing in. Every second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, a loud banging from outside the car shattered her thoughts. The infected had reached them. Their hands banged against the windows, their ragged moans reverberating in the confined space of the vehicle. The glass rattled with each pounding blow, the tension building. Samantha's heart raced faster. Get us out of here. Michael hissed, panic creeping into his voice for the first time since he had climbed into the car. Samantha's gaze shifted to the rearview mirror. There was no way out. The streets were clogged with infected in every direction. She had no plan left, no escape. In that moment, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to die trapped in this car, not with a stranger who had lied to her, not with a man who had betrayed her trust. She couldn't. She wouldn't. She threw the car into reverse and slammed the pedal to the floor, the tires screeching as they skidded backward, narrowly missing a group of infected who had gathered behind them. The car lurched and twisted as she maneuvered the vehicle away from the encroaching swarm, but the chaos outside was growing. Samantha glanced over at Michael, who was gripping the dashboard now, his knuckles white. You'd better start explaining. Why did they want you? Michael's eyes darted to the door, then back to her. It's not just me. It's something I have. He stopped abruptly as another loud thud shook the car. They'll kill us both if we don't get out of here. We have to get to my safe house. It's the only place they won't follow. Samantha didn't answer immediately. Safe house, she had heard that word too many times. It had become a buzzword for people who thought they could keep surviving, keep hiding from the truth. But what choice did she have? There was no way she was surviving out here without answers. She needed to know more about Michael and his group. If they were coming for him, then they would eventually come for her, too. Samantha's grip tightened on the wheel. There was no turning back now. Fine. But if you're lying to me, Michael, I'll leave you behind. Understand? He nodded quickly, fear evident in his eyes. I understand. Just drive. With that, Samantha floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward as the infected pressed in from every side. The road ahead was uncertain, but she had made her choice. It was survival at any cost, and she wasn't about to let anyone stand in her way. The car sped down the cracked, deserted streets, the roar of the engine blending with the shrill cries of the infected behind them. Every time Samantha looked in the rearview mirror, it felt like she was watching her own death chase her down. The group of infected had been quick to catch up, their twisted bodies shambling forward with unsettling speed. Their pale, bloated faces blurred in the dim light of the evening, as though they were part of some nightmarish hallucination, but they were very real, and they were closing in. Samantha gritted her teeth, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Michael was silent beside her, his eyes glued to the window, occasionally darting nervously back to her. How far is this safe house? She demanded, her voice rising over the roar of the engine. "Not far," Michael replied, his tone clipped. "We just need to make it through this part of town, then there's an old overpass up ahead. It's a short detour, but it'll get us away from the horde." Samantha's gaze flickered to the streets around them. Abandoned cars littered the roads, some flipped on their sides, others crushed and mangled. The once thriving city had become a ghost town, its shattered remains a silent reminder of the world before the outbreak. The sound of scraping metal jerked her attention back to the rearview mirror. The infected had reached the rear of the car, and she could hear their desperate clawing at the windows, the wet sound of their decayed fingers dragging against the glass. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched one of them, a particularly large, grotesque creature, lunge forward with unnerving speed, its bony hands pressing against the back window. "No time to waste," Samantha muttered under her breath, pushing the pedal to the floor and steering hard to the left. The car swerved, narrowly missing a wrecked bus that blocked the street, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. As she took the next turn, her eyes locked onto Michael, his expression tight, his fingers twitching. He was still clutching the armrest, but there was something different in his eyes now. Fear? Guilt? She couldn't tell. "We don't have a lot of time, Michael," she said sharply, her voice tight with urgency. "If there's anything you're not telling me, now's the time to say it. I need to know everything if we're going to make it." Michael swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror again. The infected were relentless, and they weren't far behind. "I told you everything," he said, his voice strained. "There's more than just the infected out here. The group I told you about, they don't just want me. They want all of us." Samantha's heart sank. She had already heard enough to know that the world was filled with monsters far worse than the zombies. "What does that mean?" she demanded. "What do you mean, all of us?" Michael's jaw clenched. He hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not the only one they're after. They want anyone who's still alive. They have this twisted idea, they believe the world needs to be reborn. They want to eliminate the weak and control the strong. And anyone who resists is marked for death." Samantha's stomach churned. The sheer madness of his words made her wonder just how far people had fallen since the world had collapsed. It was no longer about survival. It was about power. Control. "Are they tracking us?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "Is that why you're on the run?" Michael nodded. "They've been watching me for weeks. They know where I've been. They've tried to get me more than once." Samantha's mind reeled. She hadn't just picked up a stranger. She'd picked up someone with a target on his back, someone whose enemies were just as human, just as deadly, as the infected that roamed the streets. But there was no turning back now. The infected were on their tail, and the road to safety was getting narrower by the second. A sharp turn ahead forced Samantha to brake hard. The old overpass Michael had mentioned was visible in the distance, but the narrow road leading up to it was clogged with wreckage, making it nearly impossible to get through without a fight. The car jolted as the tires skidded across the debris, sending a fresh wave of panic through her chest. "Damn it," Samantha cursed, trying to control the wheel. The infected were closing in, their groaning voices rising above the sound of the engine. "I think we're out of options," Michael said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to ditch the car. Now." Samantha's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but she didn't hesitate. She pulled the car off the road and onto a side street, the tires grinding against the debris. She didn't know how much time they had, but she wasn't about to wait around to be caught. The car came to a stop, and for a brief moment, there was silence. The sound of the engine's hum slowly died away, replaced by the distant groaning of the infected and the faint sound of Michael's breathing. "Come on," Michael urged, grabbing the door handle. "We need to move fast." Samantha hesitated, staring at the wreckage ahead. Her heart pounded as she weighed her options. The infected were getting closer. They had no choice but to run. She opened the door and stepped out, the cold night air biting at her skin. She didn't have a weapon, only her instincts, and the hope that she could outrun the things that wanted to tear her apart. They moved quickly, weaving through the darkened streets, the sounds of the infected growing louder. The overpass was close, but so were the creatures, their dragging footsteps and gurgling growls filling the air. Samantha glanced back at Michael, her mind racing. The safe house was still a distant goal, but it was their only chance. "We're almost there," Michael said, his voice breathless. Samantha didn't reply. They were running for their lives, every second critical. But something gnawed at her, the feeling that Michael was hiding something. There was more to his story. She just didn't know what yet. As they neared the overpass, a sudden, deafening scream echoed behind them, followed by the chaotic sound of infected rushing forward. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "Move," she shouted, urgency in her voice as she broke into a sprint. Samantha's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, her legs aching with each desperate step. The overpass was within sight now, but the sound of the infected was growing louder, closer, too close. The streetlights flickered weakly above them, casting erratic shadows on the cracked pavement, adding to the surreal, nightmarish quality of their flight. Michael's footsteps were heavy beside her, but his breathing didn't sound as frantic. He was pushing forward with an intensity that bordered on desperation, but something about his gait felt calculated. Samantha's mind screamed at her to keep running, but she couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at her insides, the feeling that Michael was hiding something, something important, something that might change everything. "Michael," she gasped, trying to steady her breath, "why are you really running? What aren't you telling me?" He didn't respond immediately, his eyes locked straight ahead, scanning the path toward the overpass. But she could see the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands tightened into fists at his sides. "I told you everything," he muttered, though his voice was tight with something more than just the stress of running. "I'm trying to get to the safe house." Samantha's stomach twisted. She didn't believe him. She couldn't. She had been running with him for too long, through too many close calls, to still be in the dark. There was more to this, and she needed to know what. "Michael, stop lying to me," she demanded, her voice sharper this time. She slowed her pace, forcing him to do the same. Her eyes bore into his, willing him to crack, to give her some sign that he wasn't playing her. "I need to know the truth. If we're going to survive, I need to know what you're not telling me. Now." He stopped, just for a moment, his breath coming in uneven bursts. They were only yards from the overpass, but in that brief pause, Samantha's instincts screamed that something was wrong. And then, in a flash of motion that she never saw coming, Michael spun around and shoved her hard. She stumbled backward, her heart leaping into her throat as she tried to regain her balance. "What the hell?" she gasped, fury and disbelief flooding her veins. He stepped back, eyes narrowing, his face hardening into a cold, expressionless mask. The panic that had been evident in his movements a moment ago was gone, replaced by something darker, something more sinister. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice now stripped of its previous urgency. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." Samantha's pulse shot through the roof. She could feel the panic rising, her breath coming too fast. "What do you mean? What's going on, Michael?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadows around them, as though making sure they were still alone. The infected were closing in, but the situation had suddenly become far more dangerous. Michael wasn't just a survivor in need of help. He had been playing her this entire time. "There isn't a safe house," he said, his voice a cold whisper. "There's no place for you to hide. No place for either of us." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Samantha froze. "What do you mean?" Her voice trembled with disbelief, but deep down, she already knew the truth. She had been used. Manipulated. "I'm part of the group I told you about," Michael continued, a dark smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "And you're not just some random survivor I stumbled across." His gaze locked onto hers, a twisted gleam in his eyes. "You're bait. You're here to draw them out." Samantha's breath caught in her chest, her hands trembling. Her mind raced. Her entire world shifted, crashing into chaos. She had trusted him, believed his story, and now, all of it had been a lie. "Bait," she whispered, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "You set me up?" Michael's smirk widened as he stepped closer, the shadow of something darker looming over her. "I didn't have a choice. They know about you, too. They've been watching you. Following you. And I needed to get you to that overpass, so they could take care of the rest. You've been a pawn, Samantha. A very useful one." She felt sick to her stomach. She had been played, used as a piece in some twisted game she hadn't even known she was part of. And now, she had no idea what was coming next. Before she could react, the sound of shuffling feet and low moans reached her ears. The infected had heard them, and they were already closing in. "No!" Samantha hissed, shaking her head. "You're lying. This isn't happening." But the panic rising in her chest was all too real. There was nowhere to run now. The infected were almost upon them, and Michael was standing between her and any chance of escape. "Sorry," Michael said, his voice colder than ever. "But I need to survive, too." With a sudden shove, he pushed her back again, this time knocking her off balance. Samantha fell to the ground with a hard thud, the world spinning around her. She scrambled to her feet, her body aching, but by the time she regained her footing, Michael was already running toward the overpass. "No!" she shouted, pushing herself forward, but her legs felt like lead. The infected were closing in fast, and Michael was no longer her ally. He was just another threat. Her heart raced in a wild panic as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had trusted him. And now, she had to survive in a world where betrayal was the deadliest weapon of all. Samantha's mind was a blur of rage and disbelief as she watched Michael disappear into the shadows of the overpass. His betrayal hit harder than the infected closing in on her, a searing betrayal that made her heart burn with fury. She had been a fool, trusting him, following him, believing his lies. But there was no time for self-pity. The infected were only a few yards away now, their decayed, twitching bodies stumbling through the darkness toward her. Their guttural growls grew louder, hungry, relentless. Samantha could hear them closing in on her like a swarm of locusts, their distorted faces twisted in a grotesque mockery of life. She had no choice but to move. The overpass was her only option, her escape. Come on," she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to her feet. The world around her spun as her legs trembled, but adrenaline fueled her, pushing her to move forward. She glanced back for just a moment, seeing the infected shuffling toward her with terrifying speed. She couldn't outrun them, not with the limited distance she had to cover. But she had to get to the overpass. It was the only chance she had left. As she sprinted toward the looming structure, every footstep felt like a lifetime, every breath burning her lungs. She could hear Michael's footsteps in the distance, but they weren't slowing down. He had made his choice. And now, she had to make hers. The infected were closing in, and in the distance, a low, muffled scream echoed through the night. Michael. He was still running, but had he made it to the overpass? Was he running from the infected, or toward something worse? Samantha didn't have time to think. She rounded the corner, heading into the dimly lit shadow of the overpass. The area was eerily quiet for a moment, too quiet. But she knew better than to think for a second that the danger had passed. The overpass stretched ahead, an old, rusted concrete structure that seemed to rise up from the ground like some broken monument to a past life. Beneath it, the ground was littered with the remnants of abandoned vehicles, some overturned, others burned. It was a maze of shadows, where danger could come from any direction. Samantha's breath came in quick bursts as she sprinted across the gravel-covered ground. Every step felt like it might be her last. The infected were close. She could hear them, their groans and snarls echoing off the concrete walls. She had to keep moving. Suddenly, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice. Samantha. It was Michael. She turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. She could see him now, standing at the far end of the overpass, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else. Guilt? She didn't know. But one thing was clear, he wasn't looking at her as an ally anymore. "Stay away from me," she screamed, backing up instinctively. She couldn't trust him anymore, not after what he had done. Not after he had tried to use her as bait. "Samantha," Michael called again, his voice desperate. "It's not what you think. Please, just listen to me." "Shut up," she cut him off, her fists clenched. She couldn't afford to waste another second. She couldn't let him manipulate her anymore. Before she could turn and make a run for it, the sound of footsteps from behind made her freeze. They weren't Michael's. The infected had caught up. The growls grew louder, and she turned just in time to see a wave of them spilling into the overpass, their eyes locked on her with unblinking hunger. She was trapped. The path forward was blocked by Michael. The path behind her was filled with the undead. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the horrifying truth: there was no way out. "Samantha, please," Michael said, his voice shaking. He was stepping closer now, his eyes wide with panic. "We can get through this together. I didn't want to hurt you. I swear." But Samantha didn't believe him. She couldn't. He had abandoned her the moment the infected had closed in. She had seen it in his eyes, he had chosen his own survival over hers. "No, Michael," she screamed, backing up into the corner of the overpass, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You made your choice. I'm not your pawn anymore." He stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "Please, Samantha, don't do this." Samantha didn't wait for him to finish. Without thinking, she lunged to her right, darting behind an abandoned car that had been overturned. The car offered little protection, but it gave her a second's respite from the chaos closing in on her. The infected were almost upon them, their outstretched arms grabbing at anything in reach. Samantha ducked low, the sound of snarling and gnashing teeth growing louder. Her hands fumbled at her waist, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. There was nothing. She was on her own. Michael's voice cut through the chaos. "Samantha. We have to stick together." The sound of her name, coming from his lips, made her blood boil. He had tried to kill her once already, what made him think she'd listen to him now? She looked around frantically, the infected closing in from both sides. Her pulse hammered in her ears. This was it. This was the moment where everything would end. Think, think, think. Her mind screamed. Samantha's eyes locked onto a large metal pipe jutting out from a nearby pile of rubble. It was her only chance. She dove toward it, grabbing hold of the cold, rusty metal, and swung it at the nearest infected with everything she had. The creature's skull cracked with a sickening thud, its body collapsing to the ground. But there were more of them. So many more. "Get back, Michael," she shouted, her voice raw with panic. But he wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on her, guilt and fear in his expression, as he backed away from the growing horde. She had to make it out. She had to survive. The world was closing in around Samantha. The infected surged forward like a tide, their grotesque bodies stumbling and twisting with a mindless hunger. The rancid stench of decay filled the air, and the high-pitched growls and snarls echoed through the overpass. She gripped the metal pipe tighter, the sharp pain in her hands only adding to the overwhelming pressure of the moment. The infected were closing in from all sides, their outstretched arms reaching hungrily for her. She couldn't afford to panic, not now, not when there was still a sliver of hope. Michael stood frozen a few yards away, his face a mask of regret, his eyes flicking from her to the infected and back again. It was as if he couldn't decide whether to help her or save himself. But the truth was clear now, he had already chosen his side. And it wasn't hers. "Michael!" Samantha shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "Get out of the way! Now!" He didn't move. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had gone silent. The infected were still advancing, but their growls seemed muffled, distant, as if Samantha's mind was filtering out the sound in a last-ditch effort to maintain control. She could feel the cold sweat running down her back, her heart hammering in her chest. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping her upright, keeping her from completely breaking down. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed herself into motion. She swung the metal pipe with everything she had left, slamming it into the skull of the nearest infected. The creature fell with a sickening thud, but more were closing in, their eyes wide with hunger. She couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. Her back hit the side of the car, the overturned vehicle offering her only a small shield from the oncoming horde. But there were so many of them. No matter how many she took down, more kept coming. The adrenaline rush was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of exhaustion. "Michael," she screamed again. "You have to help me." But he was still standing there, his face twisted with some internal struggle. It was as if he were caught in the middle of a battle that had nothing to do with the infected. He wasn't her ally anymore, he had made that clear. But he was still human, right? He could still help. Samantha's thoughts were becoming clouded, her vision growing hazy. She couldn't fight them all alone. She couldn't. A sudden, terrifying thought hit her. What if he lets her die? What if, in the end, Michael had been playing her from the start, using her to save himself, only to abandon her when the stakes were too high? What if she was just a pawn to him, nothing more? The infected were closing in, their growls growing louder. Her pulse quickened, and for a split second, everything seemed to blur into chaos. Then, something unexpected happened. Michael moved. But not toward her. He was running toward the horde, his arms raised, his voice shouting something that Samantha couldn't hear over the rising noise. It was a reckless move, a desperate attempt at survival. But instead of running for cover, Michael was attacking the infected. Samantha's mind struggled to process what was happening. Michael was no longer just standing there, doing nothing. He was fighting them, throwing himself into the fray, swinging his fists and kicking at the shambling creatures. She could see him struggling with them, his movements frantic and uncoordinated, but he was trying. The shift in Michael's actions was a strange comfort, but it also terrified Samantha. She wasn't sure if he was trying to redeem himself or if he was making a last-ditch effort to save his own skin, but she couldn't afford to wonder for long. She turned her attention back to the advancing infected. There were still too many of them. She couldn't keep up the fight alone. She had to escape, now. With a scream of rage and determination, Samantha took off running, darting between the wreckage and debris, her legs burning with the effort. Every step was agony, but she pushed herself harder, her heart pounding with fear and the frantic hope that she could make it to safety. The overpass was still her only way out. But the infected were everywhere, and Michael was too far ahead to help her now. She could hear his shouts in the distance, but the growls of the undead were louder, more pressing. Her lungs burned as she sprinted forward, the fear of death closing in on her like a vice. But just as she reached the edge of the overpass, something unexpected happened. Michael was there. He had somehow made it ahead, cutting through the crowd of infected. He was gasping for breath, his shirt torn, blood streaked across his face and arms, but he was alive. "Samantha, now," he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward him. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed his hand and pulled herself toward him, the world around them fading into a blur. The infected were closing in, but Michael had given her the opening she needed. Together, they made a run for it, dodging and weaving through the wreckage of the overpass, their bodies colliding with debris as they tried to outrun the horde. The sounds of the undead were growing distant, and with every step, Samantha felt herself being pulled further from the nightmare. But they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. They reached the edge of the overpass, and Michael stopped, looking down at the road below. The way forward was clear, just a few more blocks, and they'd be in the open. They could make it. "I'm sorry," Michael said, his voice low. His hand gripped hers tightly. "I should have never." Samantha cut him off. She didn't need to hear his apology. Not now. She was too tired, too beaten down. The world had shown her just how fragile trust could be. "I know," she said, her voice hoarse. "But we made it out. That's all that matters." Together, they ran. Through the darkness, through the wreckage of a world that had already crumbled. They didn't look back. There was no more time for regrets. Only survival. And for once, Samantha allowed herself to believe, maybe they would make it. The end.